Beneath the surface of our recorded past lies something stranger than fiction. Civilizations vanish without a farewell. Objects turn up that nobody can fully explain. Names once known by millions fade from memory. History is often taught as a tidy chain of facts, a steady march forward, but scattered through old ruins, old manuscripts, and old silences are the places where that story breaks down. Tonight we're not chasing conspiracies or campfire tales. We're looking at real historical puzzles, moments, people, and objects that mainstream scholarship still argues about. Some have reasonable explanations. Others don't, not yet. What unites them isn't magic or secrecy for its own sake, but the simple, very human fact that record-keeping has always been imperfect, and the people writing history don't always want every chapter remembered. Let's step into the shadows of the past. In 1135, King Henry I of England died without a son to inherit the throne. His daughter Matilda had been named heir, but in a world uneasy with the idea of a ruling queen, Henry's nephew Stephen crossed the Channel and claimed the crown for himself. What followed is remembered, when it's remembered at all, as the Anarchy. Nearly 2 decades of shifting alliances, sieges, and hardship, so disorienting that one chronicler said it felt as though God and his saints had fallen asleep. What's strange isn't the war itself. Medieval Europe saw plenty of civil conflict. What's strange is how little trace it left. No decisive battle, no treaty carved into legend, no dramatic final confrontation that later poets could immortalize. Archaeological evidence of the fighting is thinner than historians would expect for a conflict that touched nearly every noble family in England and dragged on for the better part of 2 decades. Castles rose and fell, harvests were lost to raiding armies, and ordinary families lived for years without any dependable authority to appeal to. Yet unlike the Norman conquest or the later Wars of the Roses, the Anarchy left comparatively few physical scars for archaeologists to study. Some scholars suspect the thinness of the record was partly deliberate, that once Matilda's son took the throne as Henry II, the new regime had every reason to smooth over an embarrassing, chaotic chapter rather than memorialize it. A stable dynasty doesn't benefit from dwelling on the mess that preceded it. Local folklore in some regions even tells of villages that emptied out during this period and were simply never resettled, though no verified record explains why plague, famine, and displacement are all plausible ordinary causes. It's a reminder that wars don't always end with monuments. Sometimes they just fade, leaving only place names and half-remembered stories behind. In the summer of 1577, a routine legal session, an assize, was held at Oxford Castle. Within days, people who had been in that courtroom began falling ill. Within weeks, by some estimates, hundreds had died, including the presiding judge. Curiously, the sickness barely touched anyone outside the courtroom itself. Contemporary accounts blamed jail fever, likely typhus carried by prisoners held in cramped, unsanitary cells, a plausible and well-documented hazard of the era's justice system. But because the deaths were so contained and so sudden, later writers reached for stranger explanations. A curse spoken by a condemned man, bad air trapped in old stonework, even geological anomalies beneath the castle. None of these alternative theories have solid evidence behind them, but the historical record itself is oddly thin, no formal inquiry, no lasting investigation. Sometimes the mystery isn't what happened, but why nobody at the time seemed to want to look closer. In 1212, with the official crusade stalled and Jerusalem still out of reach, a very different movement emerged led, according to legend, by children. A shepherd boy named Stephen claimed a vision had commanded him to lead a crusade of the innocent, believing that faith alone, untainted by the greed of kings, might succeed where armies had failed. Word spread, and children, along with the poor and the desperate, began walking south toward the Mediterranean, expecting the sea to part for them. It didn't. Historians still debate how large this movement really was and what happened to those who reached the coast. Some accounts, likely exaggerated over time, claim merchants sold survivors into slavery. Modern historians increasingly suspect the Children's Crusade, wasn't made up primarily of children at all, but of landless and impoverished people swept up in a wave of religious fervor, a movement later romanticized into legend. Either way, it's a case where the story we remember may say more about the storytellers than about what truly occurred. In July 1518, a woman in Strasbourg began to dance in the street alone, with no music, for no apparent reason. Within a month, hundreds had joined her, some reportedly dancing until they collapsed from exhaustion. City authorities, following the medical thinking of the day, actually encouraged more dancing, believing it would sweat out the affliction. By September, it had simply stopped. The leading explanation today is mass psychogenic illness, a genuine, documented phenomenon in which extreme collective stress produces shared physical symptoms, especially in populations already worn down by famine and disease. Another theory points to ergot, a rye fungus with hallucinogenic properties. Neither theory perfectly fits every detail, and historians continue to debate it. What's certain is that an entire city was gripped by something almost impossible to imagine today, and that its cause, however plausible the leading theories are, was never definitively proven. Between the Black Sea and the Caspian, a semi-nomadic Turkic people called the Khazars built one of medieval Eurasia's most important trading empires, controlling key routes between the Byzantine, Islamic, and northern worlds. What sets them apart is that their ruling elite is widely believed, based on multiple independent sources, to have adopted Judaism, a striking choice for a power caught between Christian and Muslim neighbors. Why they converted, and how deeply the conversion spread beyond the ruling class, remains genuinely unresolved among historians. Some see it as a genuine spiritual shift. Others read it as a shrewd political move, a way to stay neutral while sandwiched between two expanding monotheistic empires. By the 10th century, the Khazar state had collapsed under pressure from rising regional powers, particularly the early Rus, and their own written records, if they ever had many, simply didn't survive into the modern era. Almost everything historians know about the Khazars comes from outside observers, Arab geographers, Byzantine diplomats, and a handful of preserved letters. A 20th-century theory linking the Khazars to the ancestry of Ashkenazi Jews gained popular attention, championed by a few mid-century writers, but it has been largely rejected by modern genetic research, which finds little supporting evidence. What remains is a powerful, sophisticated trading state that once sat at the crossroads of three civilizations and left behind remarkably little of its own voice, a reminder that influence and permanence aren't the same thing. In 536 CE, observers across Europe and Asia reported a sun that gave no warmth, crops that failed, and snow falling in summer. A Byzantine historian wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. Famine and disease followed, including the devastating plague of Justinian. For centuries this was a mystery. Then ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica revealed a massive spike in atmospheric sulfates around 536, pointing to a colossal volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland, followed by at least one more eruption a few years later. Together, they triggered what's now called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. It's one of the rare cases on this list where science has largely solved the mystery, though the exact eruption site is still debated. What lingers is the scale of it, a natural disaster that reshaped empires, and yet is barely taught in most history classes. Hypatia of Alexandria was a philosopher, mathematician, and teacher in the early 5th century, respected across religious and political lines in a city still famous for its intellectual legacy. In 415 CE, amid escalating political and religious tension in the city, she was killed by a mob. Almost none of her original writings survive, and no one was ever held formally accountable. Historians generally view her death as the outcome of a specific political rivalry between the city's bishop and its Roman governor, rather than a broad conspiracy against knowledge itself. But it undeniably marked a turning point, both for Alexandria's standing as a center of learning and for how women in intellectual life were remembered afterward. Centuries later, she was revived as a symbol of reason, of science, of what's lost when a single voice is silenced. Some of the world's most sophisticated ancient sites, Saddle-Huruk in Turkey, Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, the Antikythera mechanism found off Greece, show levels of planning or engineering that seem to appear almost from nowhere and then vanish without an obvious successor. Historians call this pattern loosely the Great Forgetting. Some of it is simple. Knowledge held only in oral tradition can disappear within a single displaced generation. Some of it is more deliberate, libraries burned, languages suppressed, records rewritten by whoever holds power next. It's less a single mystery than a pattern worth noticing. Progress in history isn't a straight line. It's fragments. Women's names and contributions are strikingly underrepresented in the historical record, and not always by accident. Enheduanna, a Sumerian priestess poet, is considered by many scholars the earliest named author in history, yet she nearly vanished from memory. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt as pharaoh and was remarkably successful, only to have her image chiseled from monuments after her death. Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor, was vilified by the historians who followed her reign. In many cases, the mechanisms of memory itself, inheritance through male lines, authorship credited to husbands or fathers, quietly filtered out women's voices long before anyone had to deliberately erase them. Scholars continue recovering these stories, one rediscovered document at a time. In the hills of southern France, a Christian movement known as the Cathars rejected the authority and wealth of the Catholic Church, teaching a more austere, spiritual worldview. In 1208, the Pope launched the Albigensian Crusade against them, a campaign, unusually, aimed at fellow Christians rather than an external enemy. Over 2 decades, the Cathar movement was violently suppressed, and very few of their own texts survive. Nearly everything we know about their beliefs comes from their opponents. It's a stark example of how thoroughly a belief system can be erased when the side writing the history is also the side holding the sword. When Spanish explorers reached the Canary Islands in the 15th century, they found the Guanche people living without boats, seemingly cut off from the outside world for centuries despite living on an archipelago. Most evidence points to Berber ancestry from North Africa, but how a maritime people apparently lost the ability to sail remains an open question. Isolation, environmental hardship, or simple cultural drift are all plausible, none definitively proven. Within a century of European contact, Guanche language and culture were largely absorbed, though genetic traces persist among Canary Islanders today. The city of Avaris once served as the capital of the Hyksos, a Semitic-speaking people who rose to rule northern Egypt for roughly a century before being driven out. Rediscovered by archaeologists in the 20th century, the site reveals a genuinely blended culture, Egyptian and Levantan architecture side by side. Some 19th and 20th century scholars speculated about loose connections between the Hyksos and later Exodus narratives. Mainstream historians today treat that link as unproven and largely coincidental, though the debate hasn't fully disappeared. In 1440, a mapping mistake left a small strip of land between Florence and the Papal States unclaimed by either. Rather than wait for the error to be corrected, the local residents declared themselves an independent republic Caspia, and it survived, quietly and almost unnoticed, for nearly 4 centuries, thriving in part on tobacco trade banned by its larger neighbors. It rejoined its neighbors peacefully in 1826. It's a small, strange footnote, proof that sometimes the most durable political arrangements are the ones nobody bothers to fix. Some mysteries aren't places or people, they're things. More than 100 small bronze dodecahedrons dating to the Roman era have been found across former Roman territory, always in the western provinces, never mentioned in any surviving Roman text. Their purpose, a measuring tool, a ritual object, a candle holder, is still debated. The Peary Rise map of 1513 shows coastlines that arguably resemble parts of Antarctica centuries before its official discovery. though most historians attribute this to interpretive distortion of South America's coast rather than genuine ancient cartography, a theory popularized but not proven by researcher Charles Hapgood. The Ica stones of Peru, engraved with imagery including dinosaurs and complex surgery, drew global attention in the 1960s, until one local farmer admitted to carving many of them himself. Most researchers now consider the collection a modern hoax, though questions linger about a handful of pieces. The Shroud of Turin, bearing the faint image of a crucified man, was radiocarbon dated in 1988 to the medieval period, though critics of that test point to possible contamination from a later fire. How the image itself was formed remains scientifically unresolved. The Klerksdorp spheres of South Africa, embedded in rock roughly 3 billion years old, are most likely natural mineral concretions, though their symmetry continues to invite speculation. The Ulfbert swords, forged in early medieval Europe, used a crucible steel technique of a quality not otherwise seen in the region for centuries, likely made possible through long-distance trade routes reaching into Central Asia. The Nebra sky disk, a Bronze Age bronze disk inlaid with gold symbols of the sun, moon, and stars, is one of the oldest known representations of astronomical knowledge, a genuinely remarkable, verified artifact from a culture that left almost no written record of itself. The Codex Gigas, a massive medieval manuscript nicknamed the Devil's Bible for its striking illustration of a demonic figure, was reportedly written by a single scribe in unusually consistent handwriting, fueling a legend, almost certainly folklore, that its creator made a desperate bargain to finish it. The Phaistos disc, found in Crete, bears a spiral of stamped symbols in a script unlike any other known writing system, undeciphered since its discovery in 1908, and still without a confirmed twin. The Shugborough inscription, 10 carved letters on an 18th-century English garden monument, has resisted cryptographers for over 2 centuries, inspiring theories ranging from Masonic riddles to Holy Grail legends, none verified. Rongorongo, the glyph system of Easter Island, may represent one of the only indigenous writing systems ever developed in Oceania, if it predates European contact at all, which remains debated, since no one who could read it survived long enough to teach outsiders. The crystal skulls, found in various collections and long associated with Mesoamerican legend, have mostly been shown through toolmark analysis to be 19th-century European creations, elegant, but not ancient. And the Codex Seraphinianus, created by an Italian artist in the late 1970s, is an intentionally invented encyclopedia of an imaginary world, written in a script its own creator says has no real meaning, a modern reminder of how convincingly the human mind can construct the feeling of forgotten knowledge, even when none exists. None of this is about secret conspiracies or hidden global cabals. It's simpler and in some ways more unsettling than that. History is incomplete by nature. Records burn. Languages die with their last speakers. Political winners decide what gets written down. Even honest chroniclers can only record what they witnessed and understood. What connects a lost war in medieval England, a silenced philosopher in Alexandria, and a coded inscription in an English garden isn't magic. It's the simple, human fact that memory is fragile, and history is written by whoever happens to be holding the pen when the moment passes. Kings edit out their predecessors' failures. Conquerors rename what they conquer. Ordinary people, especially those without power or status, often leave no written trace at all, no matter how remarkable their lives might have been. Some of these blanks get filled back in eventually, through careful excavation, new scientific techniques, or a document rediscovered in a forgotten archive. The Nebra sky disk sat in the ground for over 3,000 years before anyone thought to ask what it meant. Enheduanna's hymns waited in clay for millennia before scholars pieced her story back together. Other mysteries, the Phaistos disc, the Shugborough inscription, whatever the Roman dodecahedrons were actually used for, may simply never be solved, not because the truth is being hidden, but because too much time, too many fires, and too many quiet decisions about what mattered enough to write down have already passed. Either way, these gaps remind us that the past is far less settled than most textbooks suggest. History isn't a finished story waiting to be memorized. It's an ongoing argument built out of fragments, revised every time someone finds a new piece, and that unfinished quality is exactly what keeps us looking.